Morning. Wow. Every Sunday, I'm going to get up. When I'm here, I'm probably going to say good morning after 16 years. You know, good morning, C3. Okay. All right. That's better. I like that. We'll do that. I will be in South Dakota next Sunday speaking at the Foundry, a church in Rapid City. That I've been asked to come out and speak there. So that's where I will be next Sunday. But whoever is speaking, when they come up here, they say, good morning, C3. But just yell at them like that right there. It makes them feel so much better. We're starting today a new series in the book of Ecclesiastes. So chapter 1 today we're going to take a look at. If you want to go ahead, grab your phones, grab your Bibles, turn there. And the encouragement that I have for you throughout this series, once again, is just this week to read over and over and over again, chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, 17, 18 verses. It will not take you very long to get through it, but I ask you to read it slowly, and to ponder what the preacher, and we'll explain that, or the teacher, what Solomon is saying in this whole letter, but in these verses of what he's saying. It was Mark Twain many years ago. And as he was old age, as Brad Jones is today, it is his birthday. And so, he is old age now, and because he's older than me. So that's all that really matters. But Mark Twain, he said it like this: life would be definitely and infinitely happier if we could be born at the age of 80 and slowly work our way back to 18. Because he was saying we're so wise when we're old. We know so much more because when we're older, we're contemplating, we're always reflecting and looking back and asking questions of, why did we do that? Why did I waste my time on that? We went there and we reflect about that. To go on out to South Dakota as we are, and I know that Sarah Harley back here was giving me all the information of what we needed to do out there. And while we're there, to go and to see and to take in and to reflect on when we travel. Now, I'm going to say this. When we were driving last year out there, we were going across the plains of South Dakota, and we could see the wheat of green and gold just moving, looking, and actually you could see it looking like waves across there. And as boring as it is in that drive, we just kept going, man, isn't this beautiful? God's creation, isn't it beautiful? To stand at the Badlands and to look at the Badlands and to go, isn't it beautiful? How can someone look at this and not be in wonder and awe of God? And that's what the writer, that's what Solomon would be saying to us as we read through this book, is do not lose the wonder of life that God has given to each and to every one of us, to look at the creation around us, to look at humanity around us and not be in awe and wonder of what God has done. Now, this letter in this book, one of the interesting things is in verse 2, he's going to start out with these words, and from the New Living Testament, also in the New International Version, it says it like this: meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And then when we come to chapter 12, in chapter 12, verse 8, in Bible study, this is called an inclusio, meaning in chapter 12, verse 8, he repeats it. He bookends this thought: meaningless, meaningless. Everything, after all that Solomon has done, he says everything is meaningless. He's trying to help us, I believe, in the inspiration of God in his old age, to look back over his life. And I'll mention a few things about that here in just a second, but to look back over his life and to simply say this: I want you to know, everybody that reads this, I want everybody in my kingdom, I hope for the future, the believers in God would look and they would realize that the things that are around us, the things that we're striving for, the things that we're grasping for are meaningless. They're meaningless. What we are going after is just so meaningless. And yet we still are stuck with probably the most important question that any of us could ever ask in time, and that is simply this: what is my purpose? When we look around and we see that everything is meaningless, we have to come back to that question. We say, what is my purpose? Now, for college students, they ask it a little bit different, but it's the same meaning. College students ask it like this throughout a semester. They raise their hands, especially the first week, they raise their hands and go, is this going to be on the final? Is this really purposeful? Do I really need to know this part right here? And if you ask the professor on the wrong day, those of you that have done that, you know what you get back. You know what you get. Yes, this will be on the final. What's going to be on the final when it all comes to the end of life? As Solomon is at the end of his life, as he's looking back over everything else and he's asking the question, what was the point? What was the point of all that I've done? And what's interesting is as we read that second verse there, the King James Version says it like this, and maybe if you've memorized it before, heard sermons or lessons on it, the King James Version put it like this: vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. That's this word meaningless, this word vanity, this word that's used right here is the only time it's used in the Bible. He uses that word 39 times in his letter, and in that first verse, 5 times he uses it. Eugene Peterson translated it like this: smoke, nothing but smoke. There's nothing to anything, it's all smoke. Solomon said this right here. As we read through this and you go farther into the book, as you come around to the very end of this book that he writes, he's saying everything is meaningless except for this one important directive that I give you. Everything in life is meaningless without God. Without God, everything is meaningless. What we are striving for, what we are getting up to go to work for, everything is meaningless. Now, if you've got your Bibles open, if you're there, just in the very first verse, it says this: these are the words of the teacher. Now, that word is translated through the Greek Septuagint. The Old Testament was translated into Greek. And so that word right there, teacher, comes from that. There's about 4 uses of the word in the Greek language for that. The second one would be the preacher, the proclaimer, the teacher. Another word for that could be the philosopher. Because what's interesting about this word, the preacher, the teacher, the philosopher, whatever you want to say in the Greek, it's the word ecclesia. Now, maybe you've heard the word ecclesia before in somebody preaching and teaching, especially in the New Testament and through the book of Acts. The word ecclesia means the called out ones. The called out ones, and we translate that about anywhere in the New Testament, we translate it the church. The church. But another little ending to that means the gathering. So the church is a gathering of people, and this word right here means the person that gathers. The person that gathers. Solomon has gathered all of this wisdom. When you look at the book of Proverbs, which is also authored by Solomon, and we realize that we have 31 chapters, and we could add up all the verses there, we do and know this, that there are thousands of other proverbs that Solomon wrote down, thousands of other thoughts that Solomon had someone take a note of as he was thinking and as he was philosophizing about the world. So right here in this letter, he has gathered together 12 chapters. He's gathered together a couple of stories. He's gathered together all of these thoughts and so many so interesting thoughts that we will lay out for you. He is gathering them all in, and he's giving you a philosophy of life. A philosophy of life, a way to live your life meaningless. When we start out in life, we need to teach our children, we need to understand ourselves meaningless. But we need to gather experience. And that's what he is saying to us. I want you to gather experience through life as you are living this life, as you are growing through this life. Gather in experience. An old banker was in the last few weeks of his job, and his predecessor, the new bank president, was beginning to take over more and more duties. And one day he came in as the old bank president, realized this is it, and he spent his day reading the paper and other things like that. He was sitting at his office desk and he was reading the paper. The predecessor knocked on the door. He looked over the paper, invited him in. The young man came in and sat down in a chair across from the desk. The old bank president dropped down his paper, and the young man nervously said, "Sir, over all the things that you've done in life, and you have gathered everything that you have gathered in your philosophy and your experience of life as a banker, I need to ask you, what are the keys to your success?" The banker thought for just a second, and he finally looked up at the young man and he said, "I could sum it all up in 2 words. So the young man was ready to go. 2 words, that'll be easy for me to remember. The old banker looked at him and he said 2 words: good decisions. That's it. The young banker just sat there kind of trying to contemplate good decisions as the old man looked back down at his paper and he began reading again in the article, and finally the young man cleared his throat a little bit. The banker looked back up to him and he said, "Man, sir, I thank you for that advice. I know it is so important and it's immensely, important for my life, but I've got to ask you, how do you know to make good decisions?" And the banker said, "Okay, I've got that for you. 1 word: experience. Experience." Before the old man could look back down, the young man said, "But sir, how in the world did you gather such experience?" And he looked at him and smiled with a chuckle and he said, "Bad decisions." You see, that's what life really is all about. It's about the decisions that we make, gathering in from those decisions. And we remember far more as we are reflecting, as old Brad back here is reflecting back over his life. And he's saying, I remember the bad decisions far greater than the good. Although he made a great decision in his wife and having, choosing her, or she chose him. Maybe that was the best way to say that. But you see, that's how we gather experience, and that's what Solomon is saying for all of us here. I am gathered together all that I know. Now, we do know this about Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man in the world, and Solomon was the richest man in the world. He could buy himself in and out of everything that was involved in. But what he is learning is that his wealth, that his prominence was not the answer. In 1 Kings, the 4th chapter, verses 29 and 30, it says this: God gave Solomon very great wisdom and understanding and knowledge as vast as the sands of the seashore. In fact, his wisdom exceeded that of all the wise men of the East and the wise men of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else. But in all of his wisdom, when we read the story there in 1 Kings, the 3rd and the 4th chapter, that when he prayed for wisdom, when he asked God, when God said, I'll give you anything you want, I want wisdom, God gave him everything else. Wisdom was the key. And at the end of his life, he's laying out here for you, this is what I've experienced, this is what I've learned. And at the end of his life, we do know this: he had lost the closeness and the relationship with God. When I warn so often, when people ask me about a reoccurring sin, Robin, what about this reoccurring sin? What's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? And I say this is why you need to get a handle on reoccurring sin, whatever it is that's turned into an addiction. You are destroying the oneness and the relationship with God that he designed for us to have. Do I think because you have an addiction, that you have a sin that clings so closely that you can't get rid of, that you're going to hell? No. But I warn us, we are destroying that closeness that God designed us for. And here is our example. Solomon is saying, life has been meaningless. I had it all, people. But it's meaningless. So I want to read these 11 verses and then one more to you this morning, and then we're going to break it down. You've got notes there, just 3 different things. He gives us the warning of life. He gives us the monotony of life, and how important it is to remember the old things of life. These are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher. Completely meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and it turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome, beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, here's something new, but actually it's old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now. And then verse 17. So I set out to learn everything from the wisdom to madness and folly. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all of this is like chasing the wind. The meaning of life in verses 2 through 4 and really all the way through verse 8, but I've broken those down into 2 points for us this morning. The warning of life, as I've said 5 times, he uses the word meaningless in that second verse 39 times throughout the entire book. He means it. It means smoke. It means empty. It means futile. It means vapor. It means like breath, vapor in the wintertime. We go outside and we breathe and we can see our breath for just that split second, it's gone. And when you're young enough, you try to catch it. Another word for it is like bubbles. Bubbles that come and they're out there, and as a child, we want to chase them. We want to chase the bubble. We try to catch the bubble. Now, Gibbs is scared to death of the bubble. I don't know what's up with Gibbs, but you know what you do. You try to catch them. You try to catch one when you're a kid, and if you could finally catch one, you know what happens? It's gone. It busts. We spend our time chasing after the things of the world, but once we catch it, it's gone. That's what he means when he says meaningless. Oh, she loved it, didn't she? Yeah, I have one fan today. Cove is like, what was this? I want to go to church every Sunday. That's what we chase it. And when that bubble bursts, when that bubble is gone, we have nothing. And he says, that's life. I'm telling you as an old man, quit chasing that life. He goes on in verse 3 and he says these words. What do people get? That's a word also, the only time in the Bible that word is used. It means to get, to gain, or to profit. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Under the sun is another phrase and word that he uses throughout this letter. 29 times he will use that, and the question is always, why are you doing what you're doing? Now, this does not mean that we all have the right tomorrow to go in and resign at our jobs. It does not mean that. It does not mean we can quit. Sorry, I know some of you were always going, okay, I got it. The preacher said. No. But the question is to reevaluate our lives. We say that we grow through experience. We go through evaluated experience. That's how we grow. Are we evaluating the experiences and the things in our life that we are going through? And Solomon is telling us here, what do people get for all of that? When it's all over, and I stand with many of you, and I have stood at the casket of babies and children and teenagers and adults, when you stand there, the question runs through all of our minds, was it worth it? It's been a joy to be there with the families, although they're hurting, but to know that, yes, life was worth it. The memories, the experiences, the good and the bad was worth it. But I've had the opportunity also to stand there where I know that through the past with someone, that at the end of their life, when the lights were going out, there were regrets. They were meaningless. I said it last week, and I'll say it again today. I have never met with anybody at the end of their life where they said, Robin, I should have been more selfish. I should have done more for myself. Solomon is telling all of us, you should know better. You should know better, believers, disciples of Jesus Christ. You should know better than to be chasing after the wind, to chase after wisdom, to chase after folly and foolishness. You should know better than that. Luke Goodrich should have known better than that. Luke Goodrich lived in San Jose, California, and one day, and after a couple of days of working in his backyard and cleaning up, he had a bunch of trash. Luke had it in the middle of his yard, and he thought to himself, you know, I could burn this and get rid of it here this afternoon, and I wouldn't have to worry anymore about it. Now, the only problem was that in San Jose, California, there's a law against burning things like this in your backyard. But Luke thought to himself, I can handle this. And so he started his fire. Things were going really good. He thought he had it accomplished until the winds in San Jose changed, and the hot winds coming down over the desert came over San Jose, and he lost control of his fire. 6 helicopters later, 400 firemen later, and 100 acres of land scorched, Luke Goodrich didn't control it. Now, here's what's so ironic about Luke Goodrich. He is the captain of the San Jose Fire Department. He thought he could handle it. We think we can handle it. We think we know what we're doing. We think that we know Solomon. We know what you've done, Solomon. We know what you've written about, Solomon. But I can handle it. We could also say this about Solomon right here. Solomon was the great pessimist. When you read through this letter, go ahead, please read. You can get through it this afternoon, read through it. You're going to think, oh my word, you would never want Solomon to come to your cookout. I would never ask Solomon to come to and taste my salsa that I love to make. I make my salsa and give it to all my children and in-laws, and they all love it because they won't lie to me. They love it. I don't give it away to anybody else. I don't want to know the truth. They love it. As I was reading for this and reading about the pessimism of Solomon, I read a story about an optimist and a pessimist that were neighbors. I wanted to share this with you because the optimist, everything was great. You know, when it would rain or when the sun would come out one day, you know, he would be with his neighbor and he'd say, man, this is going to be great. The sunshine's going to be great for my garden and everything. And the pessimist would always say, it's just going to scorch my garden. It's going to burn it up. The next day it would rain and the optimist would go, oh, man, God, thank you for the beauty of rain. And the optimist would say, it's going to wash away all my plants and everything that I have done. The pessimist couldn't take it. He just couldn't take it anymore. And he asked him to go duck hunting because that was his hobby. He loved to duck hunt. So he took the pessimist out in his boat. They went out to the lake where he knew there'd be ducks. The sun was just coming up over the eastern sky. And about that time, they could see some ducks. And the pessimist just sat there grunting and groaning that probably he would miss it and miss it. The optimist pulled up on him and boom, down falls a duck. Now, he'd brought his dog for this very moment. He looked at his dog, and we'll call him Gibbs because that's my dog's name. Gibbs, go get him, boy. Gibbs jumped out of the boat and ran across the water, all walking on water, running over to it, picked up the duck, ran back on top of the water, jumped in the boat and laid the duck down at the master's feet. And the guy smiled and he looked at him. He says, what do you think of that? The pessimist looked at him and he said, he can't swim, can he? Maybe that's what life is like for you. It doesn't matter what you do. We just think there's no way. There is no way that this is going to work out for us. There's no way that my life is going to change. But Solomon goes and Solomon tells us eventually through this, here's my advice. You've got to put God in everything you do. Yes, it's meaningless. Life without God is meaningless. But with God, he will bring meaning and hope to your life, the hope that will sustain your life. Second of all, verses 4 through 11 that we read, he just shares with us and he describes for us the monotony of life. He describes the monotony of life and he starts off by just giving us generations. He says this, generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. Today, around the world, there will be 385,000 babies born. Today, in the earth and upon this world, 184,000 people will die. It will be that way tomorrow. And it will be that way the next day. Hospitals will be filled with joy, and graveyards will be filled with depression. It's a cycle of life. And I think Solomon, just like myself, would say to God, God, if we are your crowning creation, if we are the greatest of your creation, why are we so transient? Why are we so temporary? Why, when it doesn't matter if we live to be 80 years old and someone passes away, we still wonder, why, God? I've been with some 80-year-olds that have pulled me in close and let me know if I die, you make my family leave me alone. I want to go to heaven. You see, that's a life that was not meaningless. That was a life that was lived with the purpose of God to say that. He goes on and describes it like this. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then it turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea. The sea's never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond imagination, beyond what we can think. Now, ladies, I thought of this right here when I was thinking of that. I think the greatest way that each one of you would agree with me and say, yes, it's meaningless. Without purpose, it's meaningless, is the laundry cycle in your house. Right? You know, my thing is, Jamie, yesterday, we need to vacuum the floor. You know, I got up, I want to vacuum. I like vacuuming. I've said this before, because when I'm vacuuming, I can see that I have vacuumed. Well, I can see what I've left. And then I want to step back and go, nobody step on my floor. I've heard Jamie walk with 7 kids into a room and lay down clothes and go, don't wear these for a week. What are we going to wear, Mom? I don't care. You find something dirty to wear. We're not doing the wash for another week. Because it's just an endless cycle that we see every day. And he is saying to us, it's monotonous unless you have the hope of eternal life. And when we wake up today, when we opened our eyes today, we realize that by the power of God, we have a new life to live today. There are new adventures today. There are new today that to us have never been before. And he says, don't look at life in the meaninglessness of it. Look at it with the purpose of God in your life this morning. So I know many of us are struggling here today because life has taken over our minds and our hearts. Our emotions are broken. And it's so apropos of what Kristen read to us today from Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, that she read to us about the overwhelming love of God. It's overwhelming how much love there is for us. We can't even comprehend it, Paul says. It is longer, it is wider, it's higher, it's deeper than anything you can imagine. Our life does have purpose. No matter whether nothing is new in this world that he says, our life has purpose. And finally, in verse 11, verses really 9, 10, and 11, he shares the remembrance of the former things. Here's what he says. Sometimes people say, here's something new, but actually it's old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past. Can anybody here this morning, right now, right off the top of your head, tell me who was the president 50 years ago? Anybody, raise your hand real quick. Okay, 2, can't Google it. I gave you a little time to think. How many of you would have agreed with me if I told you it was Richard Nixon? Who would agree with me? Well, nobody? Well, a couple of you. You should have. We would have won some money. Richard Nixon, 50 years ago. Who won the Oscar for the best actress 50 years ago? Anybody got an idea? Barbra Streisand. Who won the best actor 50 years ago? Who won the best actor? Jack Nicholson. Who was the football MVP? Anybody remember football? Nobody. We don't remember those things. I looked them all up. O.J. Simpson. How about basketball, since we're in the finals? Are they over with? Oh, gosh, please, Jesus, come back. The finals go on forever and ever, and they're meaningless. The NBA is meaningless. Amen. Now I'm preaching. Wearing a New York Yankees shirt to a Cardinals game is meaningless. You see what happened Friday night at the ball game. You need to go to those guys. It's a lot of fun. We don't see what's happening on the field, but we sure do have a lot of fun picking on each other and eating. We don't know. I don't know who won. I don't even know who was playing. We had a great time. How about basketball? Dave Cowens and the MLB most valuable player 50 years ago. This one means something. Pete Rose. Pete Rose. What does it mean? He lived his life thinking, this is it. This is it. I could make more. I could get more, the thrill of gambling. Today, in my mind, one of the greatest baseball players to ever play. It's not been allowed to be remembered as that. You see, it's meaningless without God. It's meaningless without putting our lives into His control. And this morning, that would be my plea to each and to every one of us, is that this morning is that we would turn over the control of our hearts and our lives to Jesus Christ, that we would let Him have the control of our hearts and our minds. That if you've never done that this morning, that is my plea to you to do not leave. Do not get offline until you have shared with someone. This morning, do not go. If you need prayer this morning and you're struggling in your own minds and hearts and saying, I don't know what to do. I do not know what to do. We want to pray with you because God is there waiting to hear those words for us, to be honest with Him and to speak the truth to Him and to say, I don't know what to do with my life, for God to say, good. Because now I can take over. Now I can direct your life. Many, many years ago, a young Navy ensign was given the second in command on his first trip across the sea. And it was a successful, so successful, his trip, and for the long time that he was gone. When they were in port over in another country, he was given the assignment on tomorrow, you will direct the ship, the battleship, out of the harbor. It's all up to you. When that time came, the ensign took his place and began to bark orders about what was to take place with that battleship for it to move away from the dock, where it was oared in, and he gave the commands. And they said that you could see men and women of the Navy running around and doing their jobs with preciseness to each order that he gave. And as a matter of fact, as they pulled out of the harbor and they were clear, he had set a record of getting them out of the harbor. He stood there in the captain's place, so proud and thinking of his future, that he would receive a pat on the back and maybe even a promotion. He began to dream of himself of being the captain of a great battleship when another officer walked up to him with a message that had come over the radio. It was really something, because it was a message from the captain over the radio, and he wondered what it meant, and the captain said, congratulations. You've done a superb job today in getting this ship out of the harbor, and you have set a record of getting the ship out of the harbor. I commend you in all your hard work, but there is one unwritten code of the sea that you broke. He looked at it and it said this: make sure the captain is on board before you leave the harbor. Make sure the captain is on board before you leave the harbor. Before we get out in this world today, make sure the captain is on board. Before we start our day tomorrow, before our feet hit the floor, make sure the captain is on board. Make sure God is there to direct your life. And when we do make mistakes, make sure it is God that is there, that we can turn them over to Him. Because I want to remind you of this. One of the greatest mistakes ever made was made by Moses. A few of us read about him today, and it brought back to mind one of the greatest mistakes was when Moses killed an Egyptian, because Moses knew that he was the Savior of the people of Israel, and this was the beginning. This would be it. But the people didn't see him that way. They didn't accept him as the leader. And not because of God. Don't ever think that God sent Moses out into the wilderness for 40 years. Moses chose to go out there because he said life is meaningless. And it took 40 years. God let him set for 40 years, but his purpose in life was to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And it was after 40 years that God came to meet him right where he was at. That God wants to meet you today in your mistakes, right where you're at. He wants to meet you right now where you are. Through all of the darkness of your life, He wants to meet you right where you are. So as we sing this morning, if you have prayer that you need, you come as we stand and we sing together.